talk about this loud? Is that good? Yeah. Back? So together with me today we have Rob. Do you want to raise your hand? Yes. And Brian in the back. He'll be up here in a minute. Both of these guys are graduate students in BYU's Instructional Psychology and Technology program. And we want to talk about a little bit different dimension of open learning. And as we think about open learning, we want to present it as there's lots of content out there. There's this move toward open credentialing. We heard a lot about that this morning, some of those discussions. We want to introduce this notion of an open learning infrastructure and some of the standards and discussion around that. And we think a good way to sort of introduce this topic is this video from the IMS. So if you want to click to that. Oops, sorry. Go back one. Yeah, the IMS Global is the group behind LTI and SCORM, standards like that. So this is a...
Hopes for education technology are high as we transition from print to predominantly digital learning resources and evolve to more innovative and engaging digital learning options that students desire. Exciting new technologies have the potential to help students learn, teachers teach, and institutions enable personalized experiences. Unfortunately, the reality is, incorporating innovative applications and content from diverse sources is difficult. New technologies are not easily combined to enable the effective, efficient, and personalized experiences that teachers and students desire. For example, this professor wants to develop a course utilizing a variety of digital content from multiple vendors, use a classroom capture system to record the lecture, conduct electronic assessments through the classroom clicker system, and publish the course in the learning management system. The likelihood that all the digital systems and materials integrate easily together is extremely low. The professor is faced with the daunting task of manual transfer of content, data, and maybe even student information across all these systems to make this work. Fortunately, there is an easier way. What is needed in education is an open platform, like the World Wide Web, only tailored just for teaching and learning. An information technology environment that enables seamless integration, incorporation of content, and movement of data across multiple products and platforms. This is the coming digital revolution in education. The good news is that such a platform is now enabled by work from the IMS Global Learning Consortium, a nonprofit alliance of suppliers, higher education institutions, school districts, and states. The IMS community developed and is bringing to market a set of open standards that make educational applications, content, and data plug and play. Any institution can move naturally over time to a fully integrated, data-rich teaching and learning environment by partnering with providers of digital content, software, and services that are certified as conforming to the IMS set of standards. With over 200 organizations participating worldwide in the adoption of IMS standards, the number of certified IMS-conformant products is now more than 140 and growing rapidly. Join the revolution. This is the opportunity for the education community to enable greater efficiency, effectiveness, and innovation in teaching and learning. Click here to learn more or to receive your Open Digital Revolution Toolkit from the IMS Global Learning Consortium.
Thanks, Brian. If you want to kick us back to the presentation now. So that's just a little demo or intro reel from IMS about why we should care about standards in our space. So I think the one that's the most relevant to this discussion is LTI, or Learning Tool Interoperability. It's a specification that if an LTI provider, so a publisher or a repository of OERs, if the repository is LTI compliant and the LMS or the VLE is also LTI compliant, it's pretty easy for them to handshake and have that content integrated quickly and seamlessly and not have that sad face on the face of our instructor. So this is the model that we kind of want to present to you today. In this session, we're going to try to go through our slides in about 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to try to make this pretty fast because what we really want to do is have a discussion with all of you about how do we, as advocates for openness, go beyond just talking about open credentialing and all of the cool stuff we're doing with open content to helping facilitate an infrastructure that allows all of this to work together. So if you think about a triangle of openness, we kind of see this as there's open content, there's open credentials, and then there's the infrastructure. So we're going to quickly talk through those three concepts and then end with maybe some ideas of ways that we as a community can be more engaged in this piece, which I think a lot of times doesn't get as much attention as some of the other more exciting and interesting elements of open. So I'm going to hand the baton to Brian.
Thanks. If I could sum up John in one word, it's infrastructure. Network with him after this presentation. For the last 10 years, we've been talking about developing open content and sharing content with people. Well, that's awesome. Now we need a way to assess it, and we need a way to structure it all. So I'm just going to take the next 90 seconds and talk about credentialing, and then turn the baton over to Rob to talk about infrastructures. One example that we've talked about earlier today, Emily G. From Mozilla was talking about open badges. There's the URL at the bottom. This is a great credentialing option. One idea that was also discussed in Emily's presentation was to take badges and pop them on a LinkedIn page. This is a prototype of what that might look like. Dave Wiley, who is currently at BYU, talks about the bachelor's degree or equivalent when managers say, this is what we're looking for this position. What exactly does it mean, or equivalent, right? People are looking for this alternative option of credentialing. Badges are an alternative. The government, ed.gov, also emphasizing competency-based strategies as opposed to more traditional curriculums. One of the co-founders of LinkedIn is also looking to these alternative forms of credentialing, and I believe Emily confirmed this morning that Mozilla is in high-level conversations with LinkedIn right now to make badges available on our LinkedIn profiles. Our question is that very question. Could this LinkedIn replace or be the equivalent of a diploma that we can show our competency-based skills? Now the question is, how do we get an infrastructure to wrap around it? On a traditional resume, you have, I have a degree from this university at this date. What does that say? It's totally codified. We need to decode our credentials and make it very transparent for managers, because that's what they're looking for. Can you do this specific task?
So we kind of talked, and Brian talked a little bit about things like these alternative credentialing sites. We know we have like Degree, there's a new one called Incredible. We even have LinkedIn looking to implement open badges. And it's great that they're kind of starting to build out these kinds of infrastructure, but the question remains, how open are these infrastructures? If we kind of rely on LinkedIn to be that infrastructure for all that content, for all the stuff about ourselves, what happens if LinkedIn one day decides that they don't want to do that anymore? And so what we want is we want a more open infrastructure for sharing that content. Something that's more controlled by the community. And I think a good example of kind of how these some of these open content has been implemented into these platforms, but not necessarily an open way, is things that we can see in like the App Store, right? The Apple App Store is probably the biggest place that people are getting application content to work with these days. But for any of you who have ever dealt with the Apple App Store, you probably know that it's probably one of the most non-transparent processes, and also not very open in terms of being able to work with it and move things off of it and do things like that. They really set kind of the rules of engagement for that specific app store. We also have things like the Canvas App Store, which has done, I think, made a move in the right direction in terms of hosting LTI apps and allowing instructors to kind of play that in their courses, but it only really works in Canvas. I think Blackboard's kind of doing the same thing with Explore. So is there a way that we can kind of make a more open app store that instructors from all different, platforms, or even platforms they're building themselves, can use those open specifications and implement them into their courses? And this is kind of how we imagine that being built. We have the internet standards at the bottom. That's kind of the basic HTTP. That's how we go along the internet. We have the kind of the W3C standards, which are how we structure that content, and we're adding more standards on top of it. So groups like IMS are building up standards like LTI for educational content. We also have places like ADL who are doing standards for, was it SCORM is their first one? And now they have the Experience API or the Tincan API, which I think actually is a pretty promising thing in education. So how can we use these types of languages and standards to keep things open in the same way that these things are open? Or are we going to build a kind of walled garden, a proprietary app store? So, John, you want to chat a little bit? This is what we're trying to say about.
Yeah, we're saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. We don't want a whole bunch of proprietary app stores. Like within a particular LMS, it's great to have an app store that's LTI compliant. But what if you're a repository of OERs? How do you have to play with multiple proprietary app stores? Wouldn't it be great if there was one standard for that? By the way, these slides are shared publicly on Google Docs. If you go to bit.ly.com/openinfrastructure, you should get these slides. Have that URL at the end. Sorry, I didn't mention that at the top. So wanted to just quickly highlight a couple of things that are going on, and then just have a conversation about how are we as a community doing on engaging on these issues. What are some things that we can do to address these issues more directly and more cohesively? So I don't know if you've seen the Department of Ed has put up the Learning Registry as a way to at least register learning tools, content, and evidence about how they're working. So that's an interesting step in the right direction. This is a diagram from a position paper that my company did for the IMS as part of this discussion around an open app store spec. If you're familiar with LTI, how many of you have like working knowledge of LTI? Okay, so those of you that do, you'll recognize a lot of LTI elements in here. And the notion for an open app store would really be to extend the LTI spec to include cataloging and discoverability and maybe ratings of tools. So you could imagine if I'm an instructor in an LMS, I go into my IMS standard constructed app store, I see something I want, I click it, because it's all the magic's happening behind the scenes, it's automatically deployed in my course. One thing that we could build into that is the option for a student or a faculty member to rate that. So that could become part of the catalog display, is how do faculty and students who have used this rate it? So there are a few interesting elements here that you could start thinking about in terms of the advantages. Where are we right now? I don't expect you to read that diagram. This is a placeholder. The one box in the middle has the secret of the universe, if you can read it. 42, exactly. What was the question? That's the trick right now. This is an effort going on at UCLA in the UC system, headed up by a guy named Eric Bolins, to take our initial ideas around an app store standard and do a reference implementation in the UC system so they can at least have sort of a store of stores, kind of federated way of gathering content, apps, and sharing it within the LMSs in the UC system. The reason I put this in here, if you look at the slides, there's actually a link to the GitHub site where some of these specs are documented and the work they're doing. Tincan was mentioned earlier. This is an interesting thing that we can think about how you use this API to track learner experiences and what that means in terms of monitoring what a learner does when they're engaging with content and what you can do with that. tracking data and pulling it back into a system of record like an LMS. I thought it would be helpful to put this all together in a context that might help it make sense for you and connect the dots. Dave Wiley, aforementioned, the founder of this feast, has recently got a grant to create open item banks for the top 10 general ed courses in the US, which I think is a great step forward because a lot of times you've got great open content, but you don't have good assessment content to go along with it. And anybody who's written assessment content, you know how much of a pain it is to write great assessment content. So having a robust IRT, vetted set of items in a bank would be fantastic. But if you think about that, if it's just sitting somewhere on a server to download, that may not be as valuable as if you were able to put it in this context of, okay, we've got open item banks. I went backwards. What if we were also then able to tag them against competencies and learning outcomes for credentialing? Like, what does that look like? Is there an open place for us to manage taxonomies around competencies that are linked to credentials that we care about? And then can we roll those up to certificates? And then what are the open architecture standards for that item bank? Should it be tagged against QTI, which is the IMS spec for tagging questions in a consistent way so they can be easily deployed in an LMS? I know we took longer than we had intended. I'm going to stop here just so we can have some dialogue, but kind of our calls to action around unbundling the platform. I'm going to skip this. This is the infomercial slide for my company. If you want to hear about it, come talk to me. Our calls to action are, we as a community need to join this infrastructure revolution. We need to keep pushing for advances in the LTI standard and the QTI standard. We need to be aware of and engage in this discussion around an open app store spec. I don't know if that's even the right name for it, but it's a good placeholder for now. If we had a spec that allowed us in an open way to create stores or content repositories that are easily discoverable, deployable in the learning environments where our teachers and students are every day, that'd be fantastic. One other thing that we're working on, we got another graduate student from BY here who's in a course that we're working on this semester. We're actually going to try to build a learning infrastructure MOOC. It may not be very it might just be an OOC, given the audience. But we want to create some space where people like us can get together and tackle these issues. It seems like there's a gap in our offerings out there for people in our community to get together and figure out, okay, so what does LTI mean for open content? So I'll stop there. What questions or comments do you have, please?
On the triangle that you just had a couple slides ago, my impression was that what we're talking about there is like the testing part, the part where we determine the credentialing.
Yep.
And the word that comes to mind to me that becomes the question is security.
Yes.
Because we're really interested in all these things, but we can't have open item banks just out there where
because you don't
whoever
have
wants that
exam
credential
security.
can just go, I got it.
Right. So if you have open item banks, do they need, Dave, do you have a comment about that?
Well, if there are a limited number of items in your item bank, that's a security problem, right? But if it's a 1,000 item bank and you've got a student who wants to memorize all 1,000 items, bring it.
Yeah, good job. Right. You just learned a whole bunch, right?
I mean, if you only have 3 items per outcome in the item bank, then security is an issue. But if it's an actual bank of items, and I don't think it's that big.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've gotten to this point yet, Dave, but there's some interesting stuff going around crowdsourcing item banks. That could potentially really magnify the number of items out there and make it almost virtually impossible for a student to quote-unquote cheat by browsing the item banks. In fact, what the heck, if they do, they're probably going to learn. What else?
In response to your question, if you are truly still concerned about security, you might consider adding additional items to the item bank for that specific assessment.
Well, I completely relate to that response. That's how I teach my class, right? I take the textbook question banks from the publishers, and I give my students the entire thing.
Yeah.
Here's all the questions.
Knock yourself out.
Here are the questions. The questions on the test will be in this stack of questions. Yeah, so they study and they learn all that. But somewhere, I don't know, I think it still seems like there's potentially an issue in there, you know, in relation to when we start talking about credentialing and competencies. And, you know, sometimes it might not matter. Okay, so maybe you don't know your English.
Yeah.
But if you don't know how to plug in your TIG welder right, and you plug it in wrong, people can die. So there's a competency or a credential there that's really critical. And I completely could see teaching TIG welding or MIG welding online with all the stuff. We could do that. But boy, that line in competency becomes critical.
Yeah, so one thing that's obviously missing here, or at least implied, how many of you have an LMS at your institution? Right, and it's a secure environment where students can log in and take quizzes and get grades. I mean, that's implied here, but how do we connect the open content and tool world with that secure environment? That's what I guess we're out of time. So, thank you very much.
Really?
Sorry,
The URL.
Your URL.
Oh, yes, sorry, I'll go to the last slide. There you go. Thanks, and we'll stick around if there's any questions.